Hello, good morning. Today our guest is Marian Tupy of the Cato Institute. Hello, Marian. How are you doing?
Hello, thanks for having me.
Hi, Marian. So as you should know by now, I'm a big fan. I love your pieces, especially the pieces for CapEx. The
Thank you.
CapEx,
Thank you very
yes,
much.
those pieces are great. And some time ago, Marian, I spoke to Alexander Amond, and the interview was excellent. You must be very proud.
Yes, I am. Alex is a good friend, and he's done a great job at Human Progress, and he's obviously been succeeding in London, and I wish him all the best. We are obviously still in touch.
Yes. So, Marion, you are an advocate of human progress. Is the world getting better? And please tell us a little about your latest book, 10 Global
Well,
Trends Every Smart Person Should Know.
thank you very much. Well, yes, the world is getting better. I mean, we have gone through obviously two difficult years, almost 2 years of COVID-19 pandemic, and that brought with it a lot of tremendous challenges, both economic and political. At the time of a pandemic, all sorts of problems sort of tend to emerge. People become radicalized for a variety of reasons and that sort of thing. But if you take a longer view, if you take a view of decades or perhaps even centuries, then there is no question that the world is a much better place than it was before. And we can talk about a variety of reasons why that's so. So, even though we've had a very difficult 2 years, we shouldn't forget that the world is in a much better shape than it was, say, 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 100 years ago. And the key here really is to try to distill from human history the lessons, what has worked, what hasn't worked, so that during this time of tremendous upheaval and uncertainty, we do not opt to go in the wrong direction. In other words, that we learn the lessons from history, we know what works, and we try to replicate that after things have sort of calmed down.
Exactly. What if the great enrichment, Marion? This is listed as the first trend.
Right. So you're referring to my first book, which I co-wrote with Ron Bailey from Reason magazine in 2020. It came out in August 2020, and since then it's been selling rather well. The Great Enrichment really talks about the last 200 years when the GDP per capita really has exploded. Our growth rates, our economic growth rates have exploded. Let me try to explain it in the following way. When we talk about great enrichment, we talk about really the last 200 years. The Bank of England did a very interesting study estimating that prior to 1750, the global economy grew about 0.01% per year, which means that for GDP per capita to double, you needed 6,000 years. After 1750, global economy grew at an annual rate of about 1.5%. And at that rate, you only need 50 years to double the GDP. And so really something happens in the 18th century which unleashes this tremendous human potential, and the global economy starts growing at a much faster pace than it did before, which of course then translates itself into higher standard of living. So, in the 17th, 18th centuries, the global GDP per capita on average was about $2 per person per year, maybe $3 per person per year. But by the time you get to the new millennium, 200 years later, the global GDP per capita is about $40 per person per year. So we have seen tremendous growth in wealth. And another way to talk about the great enrichment is to talk about the hockey stick of human prosperity, which, if you're familiar with the hockey stick, for thousands of years, it was just a flat line, which then in 18th century just starts growing and growing and growing. And so today we are living in a much richer world than before.
Yes. Since the 18th century, we have been experiencing what economists refer to as intensive economic growth.
Correct. You can talk about it that way. You can also talk about that's obviously the difference between extensive economic growth and intensive economic growth. But you can also talk about it in terms of Smithian growth versus Schumpeterian growth. The Smithian growth basically means that you are adding more people, more land, more capital into the economy, thereby generating more value. But Schumpeterian growth is primarily based on innovation. And in the last 200 years, we have really unleashed the innovative potential of humanity. And so it's really the innovation, sustained innovation, which in the last 200 years has produced all of this economic growth.
Exactly what Deidre McCloskey calls bourgeois dignity.
Yes, she obviously believes that fundamental to this outbreak of human ingenuity was greater dignity for human beings. In other words, that we become equal under the law. People were allowed to have a go at prosperity. So that's Deidre's perspective. And I think that she is right. I think that institutions also played a role in it, in a sense that the world has become, the governments in the world have become much more accountable. But these two are not exclusive. I think they work rather well together, where the change in ethics that Deidre identifies and the change in institutions sort of reinforce each other.
Exactly. Now we're going to talk about the second trend, the end of poverty.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, when you have a world that is becoming richer, poverty declines. Poverty declines at all sorts of levels, but absolute poverty, which is defined at $2 per person per day, in 1800, some 90% of humanity lived on $2 per person per day. By 1980, that number has declined to about 40% of humanity. And today or rather before COVID, it was fewer than 10% who lived on $2 per person per day. So hopefully within the next decade, we will see a complete elimination of absolute poverty. But poverty is not declining only at $2 per person per day. It is also declining at $3 and $5 and $7 per person per day. I would like to note, though, for your listeners, that we have to make a difference, or rather we have to appreciate the difference between absolute and relative poverty. Absolute poverty is measured in ways like $2 per person per day, but every country has a different definition of relative poverty. When people talk about poverty in the United States, they're usually not talking about absolute poverty, but relative poverty. So that's something like when people are making less than 1/3 of the average income, that's considered to be relative poverty in the United States. But obviously, because average income is so high in the United States, relative poverty in the United States doesn't mean what relative poverty means in Brazil or Mexico or Bangladesh.
Excellent point, Marian. Years ago, Thomas Sowell wrote an article referring to an economist who argued that upper middle class people in America are not as rich as some Americans who are not in the upper class in the States. So your point is quite relevant. If you live in a developing country, let's say, for example, Jamaica, because I live in Jamaica, if you're earning 150 grand a month or 140 grand a month, this is just over 1,000 US dollars a month.
Right. So yeah, that's really the key when it comes to poverty. But it is getting better.
Yes, it's getting better. And now we're going to talk briefly about globalization. Is globalization a benefit for people in poor countries?
Oh, unquestionably. Globalization shouldn't be understood as a sort of an external phenomenon. It is very much a phenomenon that that is integral to the development strategy of many previously poor countries. Even when I was in college in the 1990s, I spent part of my life in Africa, and people still talked about things like participation in trade as being a bad thing. because you are going to get exploited. People still objected to foreign direct investment and the presence of multinational corporations because of fears of quote unquote economic exploitation. All of that has pretty much disappeared from what used to be called the third world, from developing countries or poor countries. I think that what happened was that representatives of poor countries were looking at the tremendous success of countries which participated in globalization in earlier times, countries like South Korea, Taiwan, places like Chile, and Hong Kong and Singapore. And what people in Latin America, in Asia, and in Africa saw is that it is possible to participate in global trade, in global economy, and become fabulously rich. In 1950, GDP per capita in South Korea was lower than what it was in Ghana. Today, South Korea is much richer than Ghana. Why? Because it participated in globalization. So I think there was a mind shift within many developing countries. They started to see globalization not as an enemy, but as a friend. And in the 1980s, in the 1990s, and in the first decade of the 21st century, a lot of these countries have sort of overcome their distaste for global economy, started to participate in it. And we have seen during the period of globalization, which is to say after 1980, absolute poverty decline very rapidly in poor countries, and their growth rates pick up. So globalization has been unambiguously a good thing for poor countries, yes.
Especially poor countries in Africa, the relationship between trade openness and economic growth in Africa is positive. And secondly, Marian, recently the IMF published a report noting that in East Asian countries, their economic growth was driven by smart IT policies and not protectionism. In other words, they invested in exporting quality products that the world wanted instead of replacing imports. So it was not import substitution led growth, but export substitution growth that was driven by productivity and innovation.
I think that the globalization story is primarily a success of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, because they got to globalization earlier than Africa. So China obviously starts in 1978, India about 1991. And that's where we have seen the greatest increases in wealth and greatest decline in poverty. Africa comes to globalization perhaps in the late 1990s, early 80s. But Africa has benefited handsomely from globalization also. African GDP per capita is about 30% higher than what it was on average. Obviously, different countries perform differently, but they were about third higher than what it was at the start of the new millennium. So I think that Africans have got to the party late, but they have started to benefit handsomely, and I hope that continues. Now, when it comes to import substitution is really at the big story of the second half of the 20th century in India and in Latin America. It was a massive failure. And I think that the world has learned from it, although now in some ways we are seeing a sort of backsliding from that. So in Europe and also in the United States, where you would think that people would know better, but they don't, we now have a desire to see some elements of import substitution, like, we cannot be reliant on global economy and global trade routes and supply chains in order to provide us with X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we have to start making it at home. Governments in the first world, like Europe and the United States, are trying to stimulate a variety of domestic industries and so forth. I don't see any logical reason why that should work in rich countries where it didn't work in other countries. We'll see. Future will tell. But as a general rule, import substitution has been a failure in Latin America and in India.
But even in the context of a pandemic, protectionism is insensible, as your colleague Johan Norberg writes.
I'm sure that Johan has very good arguments to support that, and I'm generally very open and very sympathetic to that view. But from a simple sort of hard politics standpoint, I think it's unavoidable that in rich countries, some of the things that they think are necessary, such as production of antibiotics and things like that, will probably be reshored. In other words, it will now be subsidized and produced at home, even though I don't know if it's a good way or a bad way. What I'm saying is that I think that just from a real politics
Yes,
standpoint,
geopolitical perspective, countries
there
may
is.
prefer to produce a product than to rely on China.
Yeah, and as the situation between China and the rest of the world deteriorates, that's going to be much harder argument to make that we should rely on China, especially for sensitive medical equipment and things like that. And here both sides are at fault. I think that the rich countries have obviously panicked, and there is a tremendous amount of public pressure on more domestic production. But also China hasn't really come across as a good member of the international community. Some of the foreign policy moves of the Chinese government, not to mention domestic policy moves, such as tremendous repression of the Uyghurs in Shenzhen. All of these things are sort of contributing toward decreasing trust between countries, and that too can have an effect on globalization. So, globalization has served us for 40 years. I'm a fan of globalization, but I simply recognize that globalization may go into a bit of a retraction in the coming decade or two.
All right then. Some years ago, I was listening to CNN, and Fareed Zakaria was telling the audience about an article published contending that we were retreating into protectionism. So I guess your points are in fact logical. But because we're on the topic of Africa and free trade, tell us a little about Botswana.
So Botswana is one of my favorite countries. I visited it, about 13 years ago. I absolutely loved it. I've traveled extensively through Africa, and Botswana sort of struck me as the one place that definitely had it pulled together. Everything was functioning well. The country seemed stable, generally prosperous. The kind of excessive poverty that I was exposed to in other countries simply didn't seem to exist. It is also a country which didn't seem to be obviously corrupt and seemed to be run well. And so I've been reading up a lot about Botswana and trying to figure out what is it that Botswana did right, whereas other African countries have not. Now, obviously, I'm painting a very broad brush here. There are some there are some countries in Africa that have had very good 2 decades, such as Ghana, for example. Namibia seems to be doing okay. But Botswana is really the head of the class country in Africa. I'm talking about continental countries. Obviously, you have Mauritius and Cape Verde, but these are islands of the African coast. When it comes to Africa, Botswana really is a remarkable example. Between independence in 1966 and 2005, it was the fastest growing economy in the world, faster than China. It was a really extraordinary, and a number of things are puzzling, not puzzling, but sort of encouraging about Botswana. One is that even though Botswana has discovered diamonds like few years after independence, Botswana never sort of descended into the kind of natural resources fueled chaos that we have seen in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. They maintain political stability. They continue to be evaluated by the Freedom House as a free country. Botswana was very, very free to trade and investment. It was one of the top performing countries from economic freedom standpoint in the world. uh, but it has declined in the last 10 years. It's not doing as well as it did. So, you know, there are certainly worrying signs that Botswana has not maintained its lead in Africa. But it is a success story in the sense that it has about 50 years of rapid economic development under its belt. And consequently, the people of Botswana are doing much better than people elsewhere in Africa. So even though, again, in Botswana, it's a story of recent decline in its economic freedom ratings, it's still overall a success story that you know needs to be researched. What is it that made Botswana such an exceptional success? Why did Botswana opt for a set of institutions which were very different from the rest of Africa?
You can always read James Robinson if you're not familiar with his work on Botswana. He has produced some interesting pieces on Botswana. And Ruta Bolt, she's also an expert on Botswana.
Yes.
Yeah, I interviewed both of them. Academics tend to give primacy to pre-colonial institutions and their role in shaping success in modern Botswana.
Yeah, so that is a well-known point that was popularized by Scott Beaulier, and there may be something to it in a sense that the British imprint on Botswana was very light. I don't want to generalize too much because obviously there are also success stories where the British imprint was very heavy. Hong Kong is an example of a country where the British imprint was very heavy and the country has succeeded. Botswana, the imprint wasn't heavy at all. As you know, the country is dominated by the Botswana people. And basically, it has a system of consultation called the Kotlas, whereby the traditional Botswana chief would consult extensively with the people before implementing policies, and I think there is something to it. I also wonder, though, and this is a little bit politically incorrect, I also wonder if it had something to do with the fact that Botswana was really at the mercy of three opponent regimes on three of its four borders. So if you think about 1966, on the western border of Botswana, you had the Southwest Africa Territory, which was the mandate territory of South Africa. In the south of Botswana, you obviously had the South African hegemon. And in the east of Botswana, you had Rhodesia. Now, all of these countries were heavily anti-communist, and Botswana at that time didn't have an army. It didn't have an army until 1974 or 1977, so it couldn't defend itself. So I do think that there were limitations in terms of the sort of number of policies that the newly independent Botswana could opt for. For example, I don't think that it was feasible for Botswana to opt for Marxism in the way that some other countries have opted for, because obviously they couldn't defend themselves, and the countries that were their neighbors were very heavily anti-Marxist. So I also think that the level of independent decision making within Botswana in the first 2 decades of the Botswana independence was heavily restricted.
And remember, politics obviously played a role in Botswana. Unlike other territories in Africa and the Caribbean, the government decided to appropriate British institutions and policies that were relevant to the context in Botswana. So as you rightfully said, people in Botswana did not have the time to go off on a Marxist tangent or a socialist tangent.
Yeah, so I think that was part of it. And also I think that you know, I mean, let's say that you are, by the way, I think that very highly of Seretse Khama. I think that the first president of Botswana, yeah, but the first president of Botswana was a very good man. And but you know, now we are getting into very difficult subject of things like, you know, the great man interpretation of history. Is it really the case that Botswana has succeeded primarily because it had a good man in charge, as opposed to as opposed to the fact that, you know, Ghana got Nkrumah and Zimbabwe got Mugabe. I don't know. I think that it was a confluence of events. So one of the things we have to think about is that if Botswana was going to actually exploit its mineral wealth, especially diamonds, it obviously needed Western expertise. Well, where were they going to get it? They were going to get it from De Beers in South Africa, which had a long history of exploitation of oil, exploration of diamonds and gold in South Africa. The alternative was to bring in the Russians, but as I said, the surrounding countries would have none of it. So Botswana had to rely on the South African expertise, on the beers, and actually the Botswana government formed a company called Debswana, and it was 50% owned by the Botswana government and 50% by the beers. And basically, they had this mutually advantageous relationship whereby Botswana allowed a South African company called De Beers to exploit its mineral wealth, but at the same time, it got 50% of the profits from whatever De Beers made. But so what I'm trying to say in a sort of long and inarticulate way is that Botswana basically couldn't have gone and expropriated De Beers. It had to work with them rather than against them because of this geopolitical atmosphere and region in which it found itself.
All right. It's similar to the argument made by Mark Zachary Taylor that innovative countries tend to be under significant political stress.
That may well be. Yeah, I'm not familiar with that argument.
Yeah, but so on the topic of Botswana, Marian, we were saying that the great man perspective of history is a bit outdated and you didn't really want to touch on that topic. But luckily for us, there is a paper. I don't remember the name of the paper now, but the paper is asserting a relationship between the first leader of an African country and long-term development.
Yeah, so I'm not familiar with that literature. I have a pet theory, which I haven't actually studied at length, or I didn't research it at length, but I happen to think that what screwed Africa was that it became independent at the worst possible moment. Let me explain that. If Africa has become independent in the 1920s or the 1940s, or in the 1970s and the 1980s, it would probably have opted for different institutions and for different economic arrangements than it did in the 1960s. You've got to think that in the 1960s, communism and socialism really seemed like they were working. The Soviets sent Sputnik up to space in 1957. There was a Cuban Missile Crisis in 1961. The Western world sort of blew up in protest and anti-culture in the 1960s. Western values, Western economic systems, specifically capitalism, seemed to be on the back foot throughout the 1960s. And whereas socialism seemed to be on the upswing. By the late 1970s and the early 1980s, every normal person in the world understood that communism was not the way to go because the Soviet Union was basically falling apart. It was clear that technological change in the Soviet Union was very far behind that of the United States. But in 1960s, it wasn't clear. You know, the Soviets were sending things to space. They had the first man in space and all sorts of other things. So you could make a case in the 60s that socialism was a workable proposition. And it is right at this time that many of these African countries become independent. So it wasn't crazy to think that, you know, they would become more developed at a faster pace by embracing socialism. And what I'm saying is that it was a tragedy of the timing.
I agree with you. Before you explain the issue, I was actually about to say that in the 1960s, communism was quite popular, unlike the 80s, 90s. So we're on the same page, I guess. But I think another seminal issue in African development is the role of institutional complexity. So Ghana may not be as famous as Botswana, but relative to Nigeria and other countries in Africa, Ghana has done well. And I'm not surprised because the people of Ghana, they have a longer duration of managing institutions. The Asante Empire was one of the leading empires in West Africa.
Um, Depends on what your definition of success is. Obviously, the Nkrumah years were
Not good. Obviously, I'm not referring
very
to, but
difficult. No, no, I know. But if you think about, if you compare South Korea and Ghana, I mean, that's not a crazy comparison to make because Ghana was richer than South Korea in 1950, maybe as late as 1960. And now South Korea is something like 13 times or 15 times richer than Ghana. I suspect that had Ghana never gone through the Nkrumah years and it didn't have all those, and then there was a dictatorship under, what was his name? A flight lieutenant, gosh, I can't remember his name now. George, I'm
yeah,
blanking on his name. But had they not had so much political turmoil and the shifts from socialism to capitalism and then back again, they would probably, I mean, I see no reason why a sophisticated place like Ghana couldn't have been
exactly.
as rich as South Korea.
And you employ the word sophisticated. Ghana is sophisticated. It has a longer history of institutional complexity and interacting with foreigners. The Asante Empire was no joke.
Yes, no, I agree with you. I mean, obviously, different countries, not just in Africa, but elsewhere, have had a very different history. But if there was a country which was predisposed for success, it should have been Ghana.
Yes, and but luckily for Ghana, eventually they elected Jerry, and he was a good president.
The last 20 years, my understanding is have been very good for Ghana, and I wish them all the best. They have discovered oil recently, recently, maybe like 10 years ago, and I hope that they'll be able to exploit that natural wealth without the same problems that Nigerians have fallen into.
Yeah, the comparison between Ghana and South Korea can be applied to Singapore and Jamaica. Many people are unaware, but during Jamaica's tenure as a colony, the institutions were quite similar to prominent organizations in Britain. There was an institution that replicated the Royal Society in England. There was the Victoria Institute, and on the eve of independence, Jamaica was doing better than Singapore and Botswana. It was doing quite well. But Jamaica, again, had the manly years, and during that period, there was a reversal of fortune.
Yeah, my heart breaks when I think about the Caribbean. You won't know this about me. There is no reason why you should, but I spend a lot of time in the Caribbean. I think it's the most beautiful part of the globe, and my heart breaks when I go to places like, St. Lucia or where else have I been? Haiti. I've been to a number of these places, and they're just absolutely gorgeous, and they should be the mecca for tourists. The whole world should be spending money in the Caribbean. St. Kitts and Nevis, all of these places are gorgeous, and yet, you go to a place like St. Lucia, which is extraordinarily beautiful, and it's very, very poor. And I haven't been to Jamaica, but I can just imagine that the story must be very similar. Cuba is another example. Cuba had the same GDP per capita or thereabouts as Hong Kong in the 1950s. There is a wonderful Englishman called Neil Monnery who wrote 2 books comparing Cuba and Hong Kong, and how, because they have taken 2 different, they went in the opposite directions, they have ended up in 2 different places. But that's also a good thing, in a sense that we know that that what matters really is institutions and values, cultural values. It's not necessarily race. It's not those sorts of things. Things can be changed. There is no reason why a Black country like Botswana is a perfect example, cannot succeed. There is no reason why a Caribbean country cannot succeed. There are some very good Caribbean success stories like Turks and Caicos and so forth. So there is hope for every country. I'm very much I'm very much convinced of that.
Yes, but Marian, I'm I'm younger than you, Marian. I'm 27, but I'm a bit old-fashioned, and I don't want to sound like a Grinch. But for countries in the Caribbean, we require a great man or a great woman, but a leader who is willing to transform these states by diverting from the norm. And let me explain to you the situation in a more lucid manner. On average, small countries are richer, they have better institutions, and they're easier to manage. Recently, the IMF did a study saying that in small countries and the Caribbean was examined in these places, financial openness is actually associated with e- economic equality, not income inequality. So when financial markets are open, income inequality tends to be lower. But in the Caribbean, for some time, there has been a left-leaning agenda. And as such, instead of progressing, the region is regressing. And we can only solve this problem by electing a leader like with your level of insight who understands how markets work.
Well, obviously, the difficulty with that is that if you elect a strong leader who wants to take you in the opposite direction, that's also possible.
Yes,
But
exactly.
let me ask you, because you're obviously on the ground in the Caribbean. Let me ask you this: what is the highest legal authority in Jamaica? Is it
Oh,
the Supreme Court in Britain?
yeah, the Privy Council is the highest legal authority, and this is an advantage. When I speak to Americans and business people, they often lament the impending decision of Jamaica to divest itself from the Privy Council. The Privy Council is still respected locally and internationally. One prominent individual, he's not a Jamaica, he said some years ago that international investors may be less likely to invest in countries like Jamaica if they divest themselves from the Privy Council. So I'm in favor of retaining the Privy Council.
So, you know, this is something that has been of great interest to me, and this is something maybe that may be of interest to you to research and to an economic analysis on, if not you, then maybe somebody that you know. And that would be to try to ascertain um, uh, how differently Caribbean islands have performed depending on their legal structure. In other words, whether countries that have retained an external source of judicial oversight have performed better than countries which have had that ultimate judicial decision making done domestically. What I mean is this: you know that when you have a country which has compromised institutions and a lot of corruption, that sort of thing, how do you reform a place like that? Well, Paul Roma has this idea of charter cities, right? That you carve out a part of a beautiful country like Jamaica, for example, and you declare that it will now have its own constitution. It still remains part of Jamaica, but it would become a free city, essentially, run by private corporations with its own legal codes and things like that. Now, nobody has been successful at creating a charter city yet, but the alternative to charter cities would be for independent Caribbean nations to willingly, by democratic means and maybe a plebiscite, to open to externalize the ultimate decision-making in their countries to somewhere else and see if that improves the legal standards at home and thereby attracts more investment. Do I make any sense?
Yeah, you do make sense. And Mariana, you're a student of history like myself. The medieval ages, charter cities, they were somewhat prominent back then. But back to your issue in relation to the Caribbean, I'm open to new ideas. I like the concept of innovation. I'm a bit of an eccentric, and I do not have a problem with a country outsourcing even the management of its port to a superior entity. But again, I live in the Caribbean, you don't, so I'm on the ground.
Yes.
Intellectual autonomy promotes innovation, and we have data on the topic. Individualism also promotes innovation. The Caribbean is embedded its culture is closer to the collectivism spectrum, and the nationalism in this context is an impediment. So for example, Marion, I don't have a problem with colonialism in principle. Colonialism is actually a value neutral term. If I leave Jamaica and colonize an uninhabited island anywhere in the world, that's also colonization. Colonization is another building strategy. You can colonize a country where people don't exist. So for me, colonialism is a value neutral term. But due to the sordid history of colonialism, people in the Caribbean are unwilling to outsource management of institutions to foreign powers. I think that's silly because I invest in economics and the cost benefit analysis approach, but that's the issue in the Caribbean.
Yeah, no, I understand that. I totally understand the history. By the way, I should like to point out for your listeners that when I talk to about that sort of thing, let's just maybe if we can get away from institutions, just you mentioned ports. Outsourcing port operations to foreign companies. I think that's the key, really. Let me give you an example. So I'm originally from Eastern Europe, and the biggest mistake that we have made in Eastern Europe after the fall of communism is that we insisted on selling our state-owned companies to people who were of our own nationality. Okay, so I'm from Czechoslovakia, and people in Slovakia insisted on privatizing state-owned companies to other people from Slovakia. Okay, that was a huge mistake because, of course, what happened was that the people, the Slovak people, didn't really have the Slovak managers. They didn't have the knowledge. They didn't have the corporate culture. They didn't have access to the capital that foreign companies would have. And so for many years after the collapse of communism, Slovakia actually stagnated because we were nationalists, because we wouldn't permit our companies to be sold off to foreigners. And many of those companies went belly up because they couldn't perform in the global marketplace and so forth. And so the key to, Milton Friedman famously after the collapse of the Berlin Wall said the key to success is privatize, privatize, privatize. I agree with that, but I would change it to privatize, privatize, privatize to friendly foreigners.
Exactly.
What I mean by that is that foreign companies, let's say that you sell or you let a British company or a German company or a French company to run your port. Yes, they're foreign, they're not Jamaicans. And, I understand that that's a bit iffy, but they bring with them not just the capital, but also a lot of tacit knowledge, which they have in their own countries and companies. In other words, they will bring with them a much more superior knowledge base and skills base and accounting standards. This is very important, accounting standards. I know it sounds incredibly boring, but to have a French company or a German company do accounts in Jamaica is much
excellent.
better than having
a Jamaican, exactly.
So, and then of course, these companies will hire Jamaican people. They will impart on them many of these German values as they would have done in Slovakia. So I'm not making a point about, Jamaicans are bad and Germans are good. What I'm saying is that this is exactly what the Germans have done in Czechoslovakia to our great benefit. So my view is privatize, 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 but do it to friendly foreigners, not domestically, because then you are going to probably not achieve much good.
Yeah, so Josh Lerner enunciated this point in one of his pieces for Cato. In Israel, non-foreigners were not permitted to engage in the venture capital program. Foreigners were preferred because of their institutional exposure. So you're 150% correct. Mm-hmm. It's about talent management.
Yeah, it's talent management. If you cannot generate domestically, or if you failed to generate it domestically, for goodness sake, import it. I would sell everything there is to sell in Jamaica to good, friendly foreigners. Let them hire domestic staff. impart on them that knowledge and accounting standards and working standards. And, in time, things will solve themselves. These companies may be sold back to Jamaicans, but that's how I would do it. If you cannot go with externalization of your judicial structure to foreigners, then at least sell your state-owned enterprises to foreigners.
Yeah, get rid of petty nationalism. Another brilliant example. In Jamaica, knowledge is parochial, and as I've frequently state in conversations with colleagues, we don't have people studying the ethics of artificial intelligence or the economics of innovation or the evolutionary roots of political tribalism, even though political tribalism is a major issue in the country. So originally, we had noted that intellectual autonomy predicts innovation. So before countries like Jamaica can be receptive to what you're saying, they need to transform their culture. Without altering the culture, these suggestions make no sense.
I'm not sure about transforming the culture, certainly transforming their worldview. I mean, culturally, Jamaicans can stay Jamaican, just as Japanese have stayed Japanese.
Yes, but the
But
Japanese
they must
changed a
be,
lot.
yeah, but they must be serious about the future of their country. They must decide, okay, we are going to turn Jamaica into a massive success story. We are not going to try to reinvent the wheel. We are going to look at successful countries like Chile or South Korea. What did they do that they did right? And if those things clash with our parochial view, then we are going to jettison our parochial view.
Yes.
And that's the key. It's the change in outlook rather than necessarily wholesale change in culture.
Yes, I get your point. But Marion, I am a business analyst. I like data. And when you're in the field of research, one must be dispassionate. You can't afford to be too emotional. So this is one of the reasons why these days, when I do read the media, it is not media from Jamaica because it's parochial. Instead of proposing policies to make the country richer, people want to lament the effects of slavery and colonialism. I'm not going to have this discussion on the show, but as someone who has read the literature quite extensively, many of these arguments are inapplicable to Jamaica.
They may be inapplicable and they may be also largely irrelevant from the future economic growth standpoint. You could spend the next 20 or 30, I mean, after all, my own country had been subjected to slavery of the Turkish kind, but we don't, and then we were occupied by the Nazis and the Soviets for a long time. But we sort of refused to dwell on the past, and we decided we want to be a country which has income per capita the average of the European Union. What do we have to do in order to accomplish that? Well, we have to reform, right? So we sort of stopped. We never went back thinking, we didn't dwell too much on the past. Maybe that's the key, is that you just look forward rather than backward.
All right, so we have to get back to the show. Trend, the third, yes, the third trend. Are we running out of resources?
No, absolutely not. Resources are becoming cheaper relative to income. That's something that I do extensively at the Human Progress. We have the Simon Project, which is devoted to looking at resources. And what we find is basically that resources are becoming cheaper. Between 1980 and 2020, we found that 50 largest commodities or 50 most important commodities in the world became 75% cheaper, even though the world's population has increased by 75%. So there is a 1% offset. 1% growth in global population leads to 1% decline in the price of resources. And why is that? Because of innovation. Because we are able to use them more efficiently, we are able to recycle them, we are able to get access to more of them, we are able to replace the expensive resources with cheaper resources. The point is resources are cheaper than ever before, and we are never going to run out of anything. We have never run out of anything. We have never used up properly anything. I mean, yes, we have shot tons of steel into the space, but if you ignore that, then all the iron and steel and copper that's ever been produced on Earth is still on Earth. And if should there ever be a time when we need to get access to it and use it for more value added uses, we can do so.
Exactly. Now the fourth trend, the peak population.
So ambivalent. I'm a little bit ambivalent about this trend because I think that humans create more than they consume. So in general, bigger population is better. Nonetheless, a lot of people are concerned about overpopulation, and my belief is that they have nothing to be concerned about, because by 2060 or 2080, the world will reach peak population, and after that, the global population is going to start shrinking, and that's because women around the world are having fewer and fewer babies as they enter the marketplace, as they become more educated and more independent. They have fewer babies, and so we are probably in 2100. We are probably going to have as many people as we have today.
Marian, now please share with us the biggest secret of the 21st century. It's about farmland. Are we using more or less?
The total amount of land used for agriculture has peaked in 2000, and since then it has been declining. And that's because even though population is increasing, the global farmers are becoming much more productive when it comes to producing, a bushel of wheat or a ton of corn on the same acre of land. And so as we become more productive, because we have better technology, because we can produce GMO foods, because we can limit pesticide use and that sort of thing, we are also producing more and more food. And so right now in the world, the problem is not really food production. We are producing currently 1/3 more calories than the world needs. It's just that it's inefficiently distributed. And so it is an expectation by Jesse Asubel from Rockefeller University that by 2060 we'll be able to return the land size of 2 Alaskas back to nature, and that's good also for the environment.
All right. Marian, I like your research on the time price of commodities. What is that?
Well, that's what I was talking about when I was talking about natural resources. So basically, we don't look at real price of resources. As you know, there are usually in the newspapers, you will encounter either nominal price or real price of a commodity. Nominal price is unadjusted for inflation. Real price is adjusted for inflation. But that's not a good way to measure whether commodities are becoming scarcer or more abundant, because, of course, even once you adjust it for inflation, you are still not taking into account increases in people's wages due to productivity growth. So time price is basically just a nominal price of a commodity divided by the hourly income, nominal hourly income. And that's a superior way of measuring affordability, because so long as your income is increasing at a faster pace than inflation, then things are becoming cheaper. And so what we found is that, and that's what I meant when I was talking about the price of commodities relative to wages, is that price of commodities relative to wages is becoming much lower.
Yeah, we work less to purchase better products. So there's an article produced by Cato. US housing became much more affordable over the last 40 years. Is this true? This is surprising to many.
Yeah, so it is true that housing has become more expensive, but it has become less expensive than wage growth. Okay, so the couple of caveats here. There are obviously parts in the United States where housing has become almost unaffordable, certainly unaffordable to a normal person. Places which are highly desirable to live in, like Manhattan, San Francisco, and elsewhere. But the average price of housing in the United States has risen at lower pace than hourly income, which means that it's about 10% cheaper relative to income than what it was before. In addition to that, what you have to understand that in the early 1980s, your 30-year mortgage would have been sold at about 13% interest. Now it's about 3% interest. So because capital or mortgages have become so much cheaper, that has offset the price of housing to a very large extent. You see what I mean? It's much more affordable now to get a mortgage than before. Before, yes, you had to pay 13% whereas now it's only 3%. So that also needs to be taken into account when you're talking about American housing.
And let me read some snippets from a book review of your book. Trend
Okay.
6, more land for nature. The global tree canopy increased between 1982 and 2016. Interesting snippet. Trend 61, lighting costs near nothing now. This is a famous paper I really like by the Prevailing economist. So this is a book review and the person is speaking, not me. The price of lighting has dramatically plummeted. Our Paleolithic ancestors labored 58 hours, mostly gathering wood, to buy 1,000 lumen hours of light. In 1992, 1,000 lumen hours required 0.00012 hours of human labor. Interesting statistics. Marian, income inequality. Should we care about income inequality?
I do not believe that income inequality is a proper measure of human well-being, so long as the people at the bottom are also getting richer. In other words, the fact that Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk are just incredibly rich has not made me a penny less rich. In fact, I benefit from their discoveries. I use Amazon all the time. So the fact that Bezos has come up with this great idea of establishing Amazon, that has benefited me rather than detracted from my well-being. Assuming that rich people cannot buy more political power, which doesn't seem to be the case really in the United States. They pay a lot of taxes. They are still subject to the same laws as everybody else. If Bezos shoots somebody or murders somebody, he still goes to court like anybody else. But economic inequality, provided that it's an outcome of productivity, not theft, is a good thing rather than bad thing. So that's the key. By the way, I need to get off in 3 minutes. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay if you need to get off in 3 minutes. So I will be
okay.
reading.
So let me just finish this point. So everything depends on where income inequality comes from. If income inequality is a result of the elite exploiting the little people, then income inequality is a problem. But if the income inequality is a result of somebody creating a new product that everybody wants to buy, like an iPhone that was developed by Steve Jobs, or alternatively a service that everybody wants to use, like Jeff Bezos and Amazon, then it's fine. It's fine. There's nothing to be afraid of.
Yes, so I'm going to quickly read this snippet because I need to come off too from your article.
Okay.
If Jobs' 7 billion represented 2.2% of the social value that he created, then the other 97.8% of the social value that Jobs created and passed on to Apple consumers amounted to 311 billion. Similarly, the total market value of Apple stood at 2.26 trillion at the beginning of 2021, implying a social benefit of over 100 trillion that was passed on to consumers of Apple products. We can also look at the social value created by Apple from the sales and profits perspectives. In 2019, Apple's sales amounted to 260 billion, implying a social value of 11.5 trillion. That year, Apple's profit amounted to 55 billion, implying a social value of 2.45 trillion.
Yeah, so this particular statistic is based on the research of Nobel Prize-winning economist William Nordhaus, who I believe is at Princeton. Nordhaus estimates that entrepreneurs pocket only 2.2% of social value of their product. Now, this is not a crazy idea. I mean, after all, people all over the world derive a lot of social benefit from, or economic benefit, if you will, from usage of cell phones, far in excess of the $17 billion that Steve Jobs had when he died. So yes, entrepreneurs pocket only a very small fraction of the value of their innovations. Most of it is passed on to the rest of us. Think about antibiotics. Think about the corona vaccine. The people who have developed the COVID vaccine for Moderna have recently entered the billionaires list. Okay, so they've become very rich. but they have saved millions of people from death. And that's much more valuable than a few $billions that the people at the head of Moderna were able to pocket. So my view is 3 cheers for the entrepreneurs. May they flourish.
All
We need
right.
more of them.
Yes. So speaking to you, Marian, is a pleasure, but I have to go and you have to go. So it was a pleasure and we'll talk again. All right, then. Bye.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Okay.